just hits you like on a new level, really, because I don't think I realised how ill I was. And that was also the thing, like, even when I was in hospital, I don't think I ever fully comprehended how unwell I was, because I was under the tree, like hanging on to dear life whilst the storm raged on. Like, that was just, I couldn't look further than that, if that makes sense.
But I think you were quite driven to be creative. Hello and welcome to Post-Exertional Mayonnaise. Today we're joined by Jessica Taylor-Bearman, who's an author and lives with ME, and she's written 2 books and a third one coming out. So we had A Girl Behind Dark Glasses, which won the People's Book Prize for Best Non-Fiction in 2020, A Girl in One Room, and a new book's coming out on October the 19th. And I guess we'll get around to talking about that, because that's really exciting, isn't it? So do you want to? We were just saying beforehand, it's hard to know kind of where to start because your books are quite autobiographical, aren't they, Jessica? So, do you want to sort of just tell us a little bit about your life with ME and kind of how you became ill, and then I guess we can get around to sort of later on talking about how you sort of came about writing about your experiences. But do you want to tell us a little about your sort of early life with ME, and then we can kind of go on from there, I guess.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me on. It's really exciting to be able to talk about it all. Yeah, so I started suffering with ME when in 2006. I was 14, just before I was 15. But my illness came from a virus. So I had a flu virus and I just never really recovered from it. I tried to push through it and got worse and worse and worse. I was naturally someone who was a very high achiever, always pushing for the next thing. So that's what I did when I was ill. Is like I was, thinking of, I had exams or I had, things I wanted to do. So I pushed through it and my body couldn't really cope. So I actually had a very in ME terms quite a quick progression into severe ME. Within 6 months, I was bedbound. And I literally went from sort of being a netball player, like, and doing lots and lots of different things, but out with my friends doing this and having quite a sort of social life as such, to basically being in bed. And I remember very clearly, my best friend, who, like, one of my oldest friends, he was the one who used to come and visit me, because I think it's difficult when you're ill as a teenager, because you're in that stage of life where you're sort of finding out who you are. It's just an awkward time. So this friend of mine used to come round and visit me, and not a lot of my other friends sort of did that much because I couldn't manage it. And I remember very clearly, like, every month or every few weeks, he would come round, and I just was worsening and worsening and worsening. And then I remember the time before I was admitted into hospital, he would come round, and we could only have a candle light. That was it, like a tea light. That was literally it. I couldn't manage any light, any sound. And I wanted to try and get to the table because he was staying for food. And I literally couldn't hold my head up. So I had to be sort of like, not dragged, but carried down the stairs, sat at the table. And I was just like, I remember being so distraught and just thinking, what has happened? Why has it become, what is this? Because no one was explaining what it was. No one was telling me how to get better. No one was telling me how I'd get worse. Nothing. I was just left. And it was a really, really dark time. And I got admitted to hospital a few weeks later. But in my case, I didn't come out of hospital for 4 years. So it was a
Wow.
very, very long process very it's quite hard to really express it all, the level of sort of things that happened in that time, because basically I moved out at 15, you know, like I just moved out and I lived in a hospital. But I think those years are such transformative years in your life anyway, that to do that in a medical setting where you don't really, nobody really knows you, or those that do, there's, you know, there's power struggles, there is just a lot of red tape and a lot of things that I think people who read my books now are shocked that happened. But this was like a constant reality for us, you know, for like the people who were in as well. So it was a very challenging time, but it's very hard at this point looking back completely, because it feels like a different person's life in a
Yeah.
way. And I guess that's how I cope with it. That's how I can shut myself, like I can shut the door to that part, you know. But it's actually been recently that I've realised quite how much I'm affected by what happened, that I just don't really know about. Like I'm sort of learning it all more and more all the time, just how much it affected me.
And I think that's coming. I read your first two books and I wrote reviews of them, and I wrote blogs quite a lot more when I first became ill, and like now I feel like I don't write so much, but I remember reading them, and it was because I lived with sort of teenage Emmy between the age of like 11 and sort of 16, 17, and I sort of had a sort of progressive recovery after that, and then went on to live kind of quite a normal life for kind of sort of 20
Yeah,
years really.
yeah,
But like so much of your experiences were in some ways relatable to me, but not to the same degree, and I think it feels a little bit like you just left uh to the gods in a sense, like
yeah. I was kind of,
as to who you end up treating,
yeah,
who treats you, and who kind of takes charge of your care in that sense, and
yes.
that
So
comes across a lot in your books.
it was like having to fend for yourself, basically. You just were suddenly like, right, you're grown up now, you have to deal with this. And I think like one of the difficulties was that when I was hospitalized at first, they didn't know anything about ME. They had no, that the ME specialist had seen ME. They had never seen anyone who was bedbound and had never known about that, and had done 1 day course and was now the specialist. So it was very challenging in that way. But they wouldn't. I mean, simple things like at that time I couldn't speak. I had no energy to do anything at all. So I couldn't really advocate for myself. But they wouldn't put a tube down, so I wasn't getting any food. I was literally being told that I had to drink like 8 energy drinks, like 40 juice type thing. And I didn't even manage one, and they left me for 3 days like that.
Wow.
And I think like when I look back now, like I feel that was what triggered my body to stay in that condition, because I
Right.
think it like lost everything and then it couldn't regain. Like it was taken from being like severely fatigued and etc., but needing that extra help, but then being left, and the body just could not like manage that situation at all. But I think it's only when I look back, because there's very few, because of the time it was. So it was like 2006, November 2006. And what's really funny about it is I don't have that many pictures. So it's not like now where we take pictures all the
Yeah.
time and all of that type of thing. So the very few pictures that I see is quite haunting. You see it and you're like, oh my gosh, like how I can't even comprehend what that must have been like for my parents to have seen, you know. And because inside I was just on survival. I often describe it like it was like a raging storm. There was hurricanes and all of that, and I was just under a tree, just holding on for dear life,
Mm.
you know. But I remember very clearly, just kind of, you know, at this point, I couldn't even string words together. I couldn't, like, they wouldn't form in my head. Like, I had no connection. Like, there was absolutely nothing there. And I remember very clearly thinking, wow, you know, is this it? You know, is that, I'm not ready for that to be it. Like,
Mm.
I'm not ready for it to be a full stop. I want it to be a comma. And I
Yeah.
very much clearly remember thinking that. And at the time, I was so incredibly unwell. Like, I didn't even know people were in the room. Like,
Mm.
my sister used to sit by my bed every day after school, and I never knew she was there. I have no, like, I didn't know anything. And so when you're talking of that level of suffering, it's just really, to look back at it is quite a, you
Yeah.
know, sobering, um, a thought to kind of go back to. But I also feel like Emmy, like, is quite unique as well. No, maybe it's more like chronic illnesses as well, but they affect the whole family. You
Mm.
know, it's like I suffered, but when I look at how much my sister suffered, you know,
Mm.
again, it's like she had a whole level of suffering that I, like, whilst I had the physical stuff, you know, she had to mentally watch me, like, basically nearly die multiple
Mm.
times over and over. And the way that's affected her, like, you know, I've been ill for 18 years now, but it is only then that you just think, wow, it's completely changed my family unit.
Yeah.
And everyone has been affected in a different way. And I truly believe that in some way, they're still coming to terms with it now. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think they can quite, you know, just take it all in. It's such a lot. And
Yeah.
that is the reason why my books were not, it was not one book.
Mm.
Because when I dissected how much had happened in that time, it was too much. It was too much to put
Mm.
in. Like, it was, I mean, I completely understand that reading them now, they are still quite traumatic and quite triggering.
Mm.
There's a lot of hope in there, but there's also a lot of, like, serious stuff that happens. And I honestly believe that if that had all been put into one book, you couldn't deal with that. Like, I don't think I
No.
could deal with it. Like, it's just too much. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
It was a lot to read, and I think if anybody's read the books, or if anybody's kind of listening to this is sort of planning to read the books, I think you do almost have to be aware of, like, it almost feels like you sort of like put it out there, and then people reading it are like, whoa, like your experiences are raw, aren't they, in those books?
yeah.
And how did it feel for you, kind of like writing it? Because it must have felt like, whoa, some of the experiences that you sort of express, and like for me, I felt like so much like empathy for you for what you were going through, but it also brought up a lot of like feelings in me, and memories from my past about how I was treated by medical professionals, but also anger that that's how you were treated, and like,
Yeah, yeah.
and did it was that how did it feel, kind
So,
of writing it
so
and getting it out there?
when it was A Girl Behind Dark Glasses, so that's the first book I wrote.
Mm.
Um, that felt like something that needed to be written. And
Mm.
when I say that, I don't mean that, like, my experience was different to other people's, but I just become sort of seen as, like, the girl who was in unrest.
Yeah.
And when you know, even seeing me at that time, and funny enough, if I rewatch Unrest now, I'm like, oh my
That's a
gosh, I
documentary,
look
isn't it?
so,
About,
yeah, it's a
yeah, I mean,
documentary about Emmy, but I was the representative of the UK in that
yeah,
documentary. And when I watch it over now, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I looked so, like, drugged. you know, I looked like drugged with exhaustion, like that
Yeah.
kind of level. But at the time, people were seeing that version of me, and I was like, you have not seen anything compared to what I was like. And also, I felt like I was doing it for my friends and family, because in the book, I changed, because I used to be known just as Jess. Like,
Yeah.
everyone used to call me Jess. And I went into hospital, and people, you know, like, they visited me like once a month or whatever. My family, like, every weekend and stuff like that. But I changed, like, midway through. I was like, right, I don't want to be known as that anymore. But it was never ever explained to my friends and family. No one knew what happened. Like, my parents obviously did, and my, you know, I don't even know how much my sister knew, but like my family knew, but no one else had any idea why I suddenly went from Jess to Jessica, and I didn't want to be called Jess at all. And you know, I wrote that, I don't know, like 4 years after the sort of the it happened, and it was really bad, like my hospital experience. And I just felt like in some ways I owed it to myself, but I owed it to them as well, that I could explain in my own words what happened and why I disappeared. And I really felt like those years of my life, like the only way I coped with them at the time, like when I was in hospital, was in my mind, I was writing it. Like, I had to write it because it was so, for me, unbelievable what was happening. Like, I come from quite a medical family. So like my mum was a nurse, my dad was a paramedic, my brother's a paramedic. And even they could not begin to, like, it was like going into a maze where you just didn't know which way to turn. There was no one supporting you, and like my only way of coping to get through those years was to be able to say that I would innate or give, I suppose, give that education, that praying to God that it would never happen to someone else. So that was the only thing I could take, was the fact that in writing it down, it could prevent it happening again, or it could be seen and someone could be like, this is wrong, this is what needs to be done. And when writing it, it was incredibly triggering, because I
Yeah.
don't honestly think my family knew all of it either. Like, no one
Wow.
knew all of it, because I was a mute for 18 months. Like, I couldn't speak. I was tube fed for 2 years. Like, I had nothing. And in one of the hospitals, like, I went from being in a pediatric ward where I had like my mum and dad coming and like looking after me and making sure I had everything, and then a specialist came over to that hospital in Medway, and they basically took my parents away from me. So they basically went overnight. They said I wasn't allowed to make my diary, because I hadn't got the energy for that, so I wasn't allowed to do it, even though that was given me like purpose, because I felt like I wasn't losing the days. Like, I could write something down from each day. And when I say written, like, that, you know, a girl behind dark glasses has a lot of a diary that I call Bug, and that diary was to sort of document the days, so that because it all mulled into one. And basically overnight they stopped me from doing that. My dad was only allowed to visit me for 5 minutes a day, and my mum was allowed to give me a wash, and that was it. And then I had no one for the whole day. I was just left on my own. And you know, again, it's so I literally went from having that support to no one, and then I got moved to an adult ward in a different county, and I was only allowed visitors once a week for like, and I was 16 at the time, so I was young, and I had no one. I had absolutely no one. And so, like, to explain all of everything that happened, even to my family, how do you do that when you're only allowed to see them for half an hour a weekend? Like you couldn't. So all this suffering sort of happened without anyone knowing. It was behind closed doors, it was in that hospital environment. So in a way, although it was hard to write, it felt necessary to write, and it felt like I was explaining to a lot of people without having to have that conversation in person. But I know, for example, that my brother and sister can't read my books. Like, they can't. I mean, they probably could read the one that's coming out now, but they can't, because it was so traumatic
So they
for
haven't
the
even
whole family.
tried.
I think my sister, no, I don't know that much about my brother, but my sister, she couldn't even mention the hospital.
Right.
She couldn't, like, it's only been in the last couple of years that she's opened up about how it was, because she went from a family of 5 who were busy doing everything to basically being on her own the whole time, because my brother's older than me. He went off to work. He couldn't really deal with it, so he just worked. And then my sister was she was like 10 when I got ill. And the really, really, the thing that really sucks about the whole situation is, like, my sister now suffers with long COVID.
Oh
So
man.
she now suffers similarly to me, and it's so, like, it just breaks you, because like, I know what she's going through, and I don't want anyone to go through that. So yeah.
And I think one of the things that comes through a lot, and I think you've just expressed that, is like it felt like a very, like, I think you talk about different hospital settings that you kind of were in for different periods of time, but it felt like the ones that were very negative were very controlling, like you've just said, and it it must have felt like you're already a prisoner within your own body, aren't you, because
Yeah.
of the ME? But then you're like doubly a prisoner because of this sort of controlling nature of the medical environment, and these sort of strict sort of psychiatrists that are kind of putting down rules that are not really evidence based in any way whatsoever. It's just it just felt so frustrating reading it on
Yeah,
your behalf. Like,
yeah. I think, like, the way I managed it and the way I coped with it was to come up with characters.
yeah.
So, like, I couldn't speak, but I could make some good characters up of them. So I made them into caricatures almost. So, like, I had one who was my OT, and oh God, she was honestly so hard, so hard, and I couldn't speak. And I just, like, the only way I could cope with her sort of was to make her into, like, this caricature in my head. Like, so when she came round, I was almost laughing at what I was imagining her to be like. But that is honestly how I coped. I know that was one of your sort of questions, was how was that managing to sort of, I did, like, make them into characters, and very early on, my coping mechanism was the idea that I was writing a book, because before I was ill, I was going to write a book with my gran, but it was not a autobiographical book at all. It was going to be just a book that we started writing on a holiday. So I was always writing. I always, and for me, that gave me purpose through the suffering. Because I honestly, like, it's really hard, because in the ME world, like, we are now so much more aware of how pushing through something is unhelpful, having unrealistic goals is unhelpful, and all those kind of things. And I was talking about this to my dad, but honestly, like, it's so weird, because now I've sort of come to peace with how I am and my condition, and the fact that I live with it and not against it. But during that time when I was hospitalized, and actually a few years afterwards, I had to believe it was a fight, and I had to believe that I had to keep going. And I and my dad even said, like, I honestly, if you hadn't been like that, I don't know you would ever have actually made it out of hospital. It was that severe. Like, you know, I had to, in my brain, think I can't, like, you know, I said, like, I couldn't have it as a full stop. It was not meant to be a full stop. And in my brain, like, me defining that, defying that, and actually saying, no, that's not how it, and for me, that's one of the reasons, like, I sort of kept going. And,
It's a
you
really
know,
difficult balance, isn't it? Because
yeah,
we Dov and I have talked on the podcast before about I think we have about the idea of like illness warriors, and like I struggle with that term because you can't fight the illness, but at the same
no,
time you've got to have a sense of like resilience. So it's like I get where people are coming from that kind of use that term, and that's
yeah,
fine if people want to use it, but
it's,
it's a difficult one, isn't it?
yeah.
That you sort of on the fence with it a little bit.
Well, I think, like, even 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, I would have used that term, but I don't now, and I wouldn't now. And it's very hard because, in a way, me having that sort of fighting mindset was the reason I survived, but it wasn't
Yeah.
the reason I thrived. Do you see what I mean? Like, I survived through it, but it was not that it would ever be enjoyable, but you know what I mean? It was a hard slog. Like, it was awful. Whereas now, where I don't feel that I have to constantly fight it, I can live within the parameters. I don't think I ever gave myself chance to live within those parameters. I know I didn't really have many parameters. Like, I had one room, but it was always the next thing. It was always, what could I do to raise awareness? What could I do to stop this? That was the sort of the mindset constantly. Yeah, and then it's only when I go back and, like, I watch, like, the I made a YouTube video in 2012, I think, and it's, you go back to watching that and it just hits you, like, on a new level, really, because I don't think I realised how ill I was. And that was also the thing, like, even when I was in hospital, I don't think I ever fully comprehended how unwell I was, because I was under the tree, like, hanging on to dear life whilst the storm raged on. Like, that was just, I couldn't look further than that, if that makes sense.
But I think you were quite driven to be creative, and like one of the things that I was thinking about was you almost had, even though you weren't physically able to do much at all, like did you, was it, am I right in saying you had these like laugh drawings
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you almost like kind of had a pen and a pad, and almost like whatever came out from your kind of,
From laughing. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So basically, this came from not being able to speak. And I am naturally a very creative person. If I think about it today, creativity is what I use as a, like, coping mechanism. And I
Yeah.
probably have always used it as a coping mechanism. But now, actually, as my life has become, you know, less barricaded in a sense, I actually feel I need the creativity even more. I
Yeah.
need to ground myself in that and actually have that time where I'm not, I don't know, it's really, it's very, it's hard, but I have to have that time where I'm just creating. And when I'm stressed out or I'm in a flare up of symptoms, my creative thing will stop. And then I'll be coming up with all these ideas and I can't rest. And it's really
Yeah.
annoying. But yeah, no, yeah, I basically came up with this idea of painting through laughter. It's quite funny because, like, now I'm considered by some people, like, I'm on, like, I'm considered as an artist, and this always makes me laugh because I'm like, I gave up art when I was 12. Like, I had no interest. I guess it's because they sort of boxed you in a bit, but yeah, so I started doing these paintings. But basically, the idea came to me when I couldn't speak, and I realised that when someone made me laugh, my body would shake, like it was an involuntary movement. I couldn't help it, like it would just rock. So my idea was to put a canvas on my stomach and have a paintbrush in my hand, and every time someone made me laugh, it would make the paintbrush move. And so that's what my early paintings were. They were just literally laughter.
Abstract. Yeah.
Laughter, abstract,
Yeah.
very
I love it.
abstract, but they were just literally like, you know, laughter on a on painting. And it was actually so freeing, so freeing to do, and I absolutely loved it. But soon, when I could move properly, even when I could move properly, I still did laughter paintings, but now I don't do them because I feel like I've sort of gone past that stage of necessarily being able to do them in the same raw way that they were first created, if that makes sense, because you can't pretend you can't move. You know, like the whole essence of the laughter paintings were the fact it was like hope bursting out of you. You know, it was laughter, it was positivity sort of bursting out of you. But I have actually started painting again, and these paintings are all sort of an, I don't know, like I wanted to try and make my books really accessible for people, and I wanted people to see the world that I was in, because I think that's the thing, isn't it? Like, I haven't read them for a long time, like I haven't gone through them again, but I wanted people to see it, not just read it. So I've started doing these paintings, which I'm hoping are going to be sort of ready for when my book comes out. But they're all on the imagery that's used in the books. So I've done one that is the world of one room, and it's 9 separate small canvases that make up a room but is a world at the same time. So it's what I imagined the world of one room to be, because it's quite a thing when you say a world of one room. It's very hard to I don't know, I feel like that's quite a thing to say, you know, like it's quite a, like, what, how can that be? And you know, at that time I made the decision to not call it a prison. It could have been a prison, it could have been a world, but for me, like, and coping, being, you know, I was in a world, in that room for like 12 years, so to cope with it, I made it a world, and so I created that via paintings. And I've just done one because I've done one on not being able to speak. So, like, I would repeat the same sentence over and over again in my head. And sometimes, like, some of the words would come out, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they were very muddled up. It was almost like I'd had sort of stroke symptoms, in the sense like my whole body had completely forgotten how to work. So I've done sort of a painting on that, and it's so basically I'm doing different ones on the imagery used in all 3 books, to enable people to really see the world I inhabited, and see not just the suffering, but also see the, you know, it was a colourful world in its own way, and you know, nothing is linear. It wasn't one. It wasn't just up, it wasn't down, it was like the whole time. So I kind of wanted to be able to express that. So when I do launch my 3rd book, I mean, it's going to be after the actual launch day, but I'm going to do it as a experience where people can see all the paintings together, and they can see what that world represented. And I think, like, for me, it was really important, because although it was a horrendous thing to sort of go through and everything is very hard about it, it is also like, I've had friends die, you know, that's the reality. Like, I've lost friends to ME, and I know how unbelievably lucky I am to still be here.
Yeah.
And I feel like, although it was a really hard sort of time, like, ME has made up 18 years of my life. It wouldn't be right for me to just disregard it. You know, I can't just go away from it. That is part of me, you know. And so I want people to see that part of my life, because that is part of my life. And it's made me who I am today. It's probably added some good things and bad things. So I want people to see that, basically.
Yeah, it's definitely relatable. Yeah. One thing I was going to ask you about was like how you managed like risk taking when you were ill, and then I suppose that gets onto A Girl in One Room, because you sort of like, and I guess it comes back to what we were saying earlier, wasn't it, in terms of like having to fight through things, but at the same time, like, how did you find the balance? Because you went to speak at a public event, you sort of like, it was different thing, you know, you went
Yeah,
shopping
yeah,
on a bed effectively,
yeah,
and
yeah,
like, and then obviously getting married and stuff, but
yeah.
and each one of those things was like taking a risk in itself, not knowing kind of how much it was going to impact you and impact your ME and your body and stuff. And how did you kind of like make sense of that? Because you must have seen the progress that you were making, but at the same time, you're always living with that kind of fear
Mm.
of what's going to happen if I do this. Was that a really difficult balance to try and
Oh, it's a
find?
hugely difficult balance. And I honestly think that if I did it now, I'd have done it differently. And I really like, it sounds strange to be like that, but I took too many risks. I took
Right.
far too many risks. Like, I probably still take too many now. I think a lot of that, personally, I believe comes with the naivety of being a very young person who got ill and
Mm,
not knowing about the condition beforehand, not knowing people who were really severely affected, not knowing, not knowing that you could become so unwell that you would pass away from a condition like that. Like, that was never in my mind. And so, like, for me, it was all about sort of, I don't know, like, I had to make it count. Like, that
mm,
was my coping mechanism. That was like how I managed, was I was coping, thinking I had still lived in that time period. I
mm,
couldn't have forgotten years. I couldn't have,
mm,
like, I couldn't mentally deal with that.
mm,
Yeah, and so I did take too many risks. But some of those risks I would never take away now. You know,
no,
I
yeah,
think, like,
yeah.
it's a tricky one. It's like,
Mm,
you know, I am grateful for them. I'm also know that a lot of them shouldn't have done, or that I was very daring, more the
mm.
thing. Like, you know, and I honestly think that is maturity, like, not being mature.
I don't
because
know. Yeah, I don't know.
now
I don't know.
because now I think, so, oh, no, that's that, why would you do that? But I honestly think, like, the fact that I had no knowledge, I didn't even know what ME was beforehand. Like, I didn't know anything. So in a way, not knowing was a blessing and not a blessing at the same time. It was
Hmm.
both. You know, I had no experience of knowing that that was the end. Like, that could be the end, that you could suffer with it for the rest of your life. I just didn't know that.
Hmm.
And my parents sort of made that decision never to tell me that, never to tell me,
Hmm.
like, the full thing. And when I say, because, you know, I was 15, so I should have been able to, like, look things up and everything. I didn't have a phone. Like, I didn't have anything. I had no
Hmm.
way of contacting the world. I only got like a phone when I was like in 2010 or so. Like, I just didn't know anything. So in a way, I feel like that enabled me to not worry as
Hmm.
much. And I think sometimes as well, when you had been as ill as, like, you couldn't even, like, open your mouth to drink a sip of water, then when you're at the point of, you know, being able to do that, like, you know, it feels, I don't know, like you felt like not better, but you felt like, oh, but I can do this now, you know, because before it was like a struggle to take a sip of water, you know, like
Mm.
in comparison to then sitting in a chair, you know, you're like, oh my God, that's amazing, you know. But I did a video that I haven't watched over in many, many, many years called 7 Years in the Making. And it took me 7 years to sit out in a chair. Like it took 7
Yeah.
whole years to do that. And it's actually when I think about that kind of thing, that was like, it was in my head. I had to do that. Like I wanted to do that because I speak to like friends who aren't chronically ill. And they're like, 7 years though, you know, like it's such a long time.
Mm.
But that was like, here, you know, that's what I was striving to do. And in a way it's like being an athlete in your own way. Like you have to get back up, you have to, like, you know, you have like flare-ups, you have setbacks, you have all these things, and then, you know, but you have to still, you know, like, I don't mean try in that way, you know. I think like for me, I had to get back up, I had to get to that. But I honestly think if I got ill again now, or was more severely affected now, or if it had started now, I think like my response would have been completely different. And I
Mm.
honestly put a lot of that down to youth,
Mm.
being young and
Mm.
just not realizing. I mean, I see this like within Share a Star, which was my charity that that was been running like 12 years, but it's coming to the end now. And you know, you see those children like, and you have people with ME, you have all sorts of conditions, but I feel like the children, they react to it very differently to adults,
Mm.
because they're naive, because they
Yeah.
don't have the experience of life letting them down, you know.
Mm.
And I honestly think I would always say that was a massive part of why I acted as I did, and why I still got there, you know.
Mm.
It's really hard to say, and again, you know, I have friends who died in as teenagers, but with ME as well, and
Mm.
it's really hard because like I have that guilt, and
Mm.
I've always had that guilt, like, why did I improve and why did they die, you know.
Mm.
That was like a really hard thing that I
Mm.
don't think I will ever really come to terms with,
Mm.
or know how to deal with it. And
Uh,
maybe that's why I do creative stuff, and maybe that's why I still do that and still push awareness and all of that for them, you know,
Mm.
and for those who didn't have that chance to.
Mm.
So, you know, that's always been something that I think will be with me forever.
And are there certain things that you think, can you attribute like your sort of slow improvement to anything in particular, or do you think, because for me, like when I was 17, 18, I just sort of slowly, progressively improved, but there was nothing that I did to enable that. Is that something that for
Yeah.
you, or like, because reading the
Yeah.
book, it's like you sort of pushing yourself, but at the same time, it's almost like reading the book,
Yeah.
because I'd had those experiences. You're thinking, oh, don't push yourself too hard. Don't put like I was
Yeah.
almost like
It's
feeling that
really
for you
hard.
reading the book, sort of thing.
You're
And
kind
it's,
of fighting yourself. Like
yeah,
you're fighting what your natural urge is and what you physically can do. This is the most asked question I get,
yeah,
is
but yeah,
like, how did you improve? And I can only describe it. So mine is the same as you. Like it was
mm,
gradual over time. I think I was doing the same things for years. Sometimes they weren't working. Sometimes they would improve a bit. Sometimes they would, I would just set back. But I always, like, my friend described it to me as like, improvements are like a garden, and you plant the seeds at the same time. You plant all the seeds, you give them all the water. So in my instance, the water was doing like physio exercises so that my body could support itself, or all these sorts of things. And you can water them and the sun can be there, but that doesn't mean that they will grow. And you can keep doing the same movements. Some parts will just grow suddenly, some parts will overgrow, and others just won't grow at all. And until one day they do, and they just come up. And I don't honestly think, for me, that was time. That was allowing my body to recover from whatever it was. But then the really hard thing to try and explain to people is I'm not better.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, I think with the pandemic as well, like, people were describing my form of life as a prison. You know, like, Emmy's world is a prison, you know, because we don't get to go out every day. We don't get to do all these things. And so it's very hard to describe to someone that, although I've obviously improved, like, that's obvious, like, I still suffer a lot, and it's not over, and it's just something I live with. And that's quite hard to try and explain to someone, especially if they've not been in that world with me for a long time. So they just see it like the odd thing they've heard about me, or they've watched Unrest and seen me there, and then see me now like, oh my God, you know, miracle cure. There isn't one.
No.
There is no miracle cure for it. And like, the important thing to always say to people is what works for one person won't work for another. So I'm very, I don't often tell people to do things, because I just know that is not the answer, that what might work for me might not work for another. For example, for me, like, my improvements actually came when I was pregnant with my daughter. And often people are like, oh, you know, tell me what. And I'm not going to tell people that, you know, that's the thing, that was the miracle, you know, like, yeah, because I mean, that comes with its own, you know, things anyway. But also, being pregnant with my son the second time around, I got worse. So I would never tell people one way, because your body doesn't react the same every time. And I feel like that's the thing people get most frustrated about me. It's because I can't tell them the miracle cure. There isn't one, unfortunately, yet.
And yeah, like, you're still living with the condition, and that's like really hard, and it's not easy, because there's still things that a life that you want to have that you're not living, and that must be really frustrating, being a parent, and then sort of like having, I mean, my kids were like 7 and 10 when, like, I first got ill the second time, and like, it was so frustrating not being able to be, because I used to go on adventures with my kids and stuff like that, and like, sometimes it'd be like the weekend and my wife was working, and I'd just like go off somewhere and would climb some hill or something like that, and then suddenly you lose that, and like, for you that must be really hard, like, having to sort of be the best mum you can be, but with this sort of the boundaries and that.
My fear is going back to severe Emmy. Like, that's like a constant fear in my head. Like, it's a massive fear that I don't think anyone really can. It's sort of an internal fear that I can't really necessarily express to people very well. I feel like it's a bit like post-traumatic stress. That idea of going back to that life, like, it terrifies me. I was diagnosed with like medical PTSD, and I feel like that's part of it that sort of is always here. I kind of live my sort of being a parent as I want, as long as like Felicity gets to experience something, even if I'm not there, then I would prefer her to experience it.
Definitely.
So that's always like my feeling. Like, I hate missing out, but I'd rather miss out and then be able to be a mum to her when she gets home. But yeah, and I feel like the balance is incredibly tricky. Personally, I found it really hard when I had Rupert as well, because he's not been a completely well baby anyway. And I just feel torn in many different ways. And then I feel like when I'm resting, or like, you know, like my door's shut to him at the moment, then I kind of, I feel like I'm not there with him. I'm not, because I can't, but like, you know, Felicity and Rupert, they're too young to know that. They're too young to understand that. So I find that really hard to sort of deal with. And the thing is, you know, for me, like parenthood, I love it. I absolutely love it. I have found it a lot more challenging with two, but I love the reason they give me. Like, I love being there. I love like sitting there and lying in bed and having her next to me and reading her a story. And I love those small little things. But it's a really tricky thing to sort of talk about, because I know, like, in the chronic illness world, and particularly in the ME world, like, parenthood is not something that is is there for everyone. You know, not everyone gets that opportunity. Not everyone's well enough for that. And I know, like, it's a big sort of grey area, and so I feel like I have to be, well, I am grateful for it, but I have to be like careful, you know, because I just don't, I know there's a lot of people who haven't got that, you know, and like, so it's really hard to say, like, you know, it's an amazing thing, but at the same time, it's incredibly difficult, you know, like, to manage. And I think that's the thing. It's the managing of the symptoms. It's the managing of what you can do as a parent. And particularly, you know, my husband, he became unwell as well. So he was my carer, and he was like, he did everything. And then he became ill. So it's really hard. It's really hard, because it's not how we were going to plan to do things, if that makes sense. But in a way, we've become very used to that because of my illness. Like, you couldn't ever plan anything. Like, it just was when it happened, or if it didn't happen, it didn't happen, and all of that. But then to add in the extra sort of thing of Samuel not being well, then my son being in and out of hospital, like, it's always been something. And that's what I find hard to manage, you know, like that guilt / frustration that, you know, I sort of battle with. That's the thing for me.
But throughout it all, you've managed to write a third book, and do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And because obviously that's going to be something that's coming out soon, and how are you going to?
So my third book is called A Girl Beyond Closed Doors, and I really feel like this is, like, I don't know, the ending. Like, it's such a, I feel like it's a positive ending. Like, it's not a, because when I was first ill, I always had this like fairy tale belief that I was going to get better, I was going to travel the world, I was going to do this, blah 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 blah, all of that kind of stuff. And I really feel what's quite magical about this book is that it's not the end that I thought it would be. But at the same time, there is an incredible acceptance of that, and actually being really joyful at what it was. So this book is like about sort of from going from housebound to becoming like pregnant, and that first year of having Felicity around. So it's a really condensed book. Like, it is literally 2 years of my life. Like, it has a mixture of a bit more, but it's much more like a solid amount of time, because A Girl in One Room, that covered like 7 years in one book. This is literally, boom, a certain time period. And I think it's like my publishers describe it as the most uplifting out of the three. Like, but it is that, I really feel like it is that ending that, you know, like, it's when I did that last chapter and I did the last full stop, I thought, do you know what, that's it, you know, and I feel very comfortable that is it. So I wrote it at night. I suffer really badly from insomnia. have done for a long time. But the funny thing is, I wrote this book like originally a year ago. So I wrote it before Rupert, and I wrote it like it was done. Like it was just it was just going through the system as such. So there was absolutely no way I could have written it this year. Like absolutely none. I could not have done it when he was, since he's been here, and even before, because I was quite ill in the pregnancy. But this kind of feels like a bit of a celebration, and that's what I really want this book to be. I want it to be like, you know, like I don't know, I want to celebrate the achievement of doing them as well. Like I feel like, I think probably in writing this book I realized how hard it was to write the others, because you forget every time and then you go to sit down to write it, or lay down in my way, and then you're suddenly like, oh my god, this is such a challenge, like so much to fit in. Yeah, so I kind of want to do it, and I really want it to be an awareness thing that goes further, like my dreams for A Girl Behind Dark Glasses, and for that I want to go back to 15-year-old me who was absolutely bloody terrified in a hospital bed with people surrounding you, saying stuff, not talking to you, talking to other people about you, doing stuff that you didn't want done. And I want to go back to that person and be like, it was okay.
Yeah.
Like, hang in there. It's the book I needed to read as a 15-year-old. Those books, like, the ending is what I needed to read. And that is really what pushed me to write the book. It's what gives me that purpose, is the idea that if another teenager suffers like I was, that you could read something and actually think, oh my god, someone actually improved. Like, you know, that for me is what gives it purpose. Is that idea that it wasn't all it was worthwhile. Like it was worthwhile to go through all that. And that maybe it's a selfish thing, maybe it is like to feel I have to do that, but it's the only way I can cope with the years of trauma, you know, like, and the years of like suffering. The only way I can manage that is to be able to say, and I really feel like I'm going to say goodbye to it. Like I feel like I'm not going to write about it again. Like that's it. It's done, you know. And I guess that's why I'm doing more of the paintings and more of the sort of around that, because writing wise it is done. Like I don't want to, like, I want to move away from it. And it's not because I want to move away from the ME world, it's because I feel I've left on my terms. I've said to that ME monster, right, you stay with me, I live alongside you, but I pull the cards. And for the whole of my life I have never pulled the cards. I have constantly been controlled by this condition. I've been forced into situations I'd never want to be in. I've suffered. I've had like just the amount of things that have happened, but it was all due to ME. It was all that ME monster pulling those strings and telling me what I was doing. I feel like I was a puppet, like I was literally pulled wherever that it wanted me to. And for me, this book is a stamp of saying, that's it. You know, that is, I'm taking control now. And even though I won't take control fully, but in my mindset, I've done it. Like, you know, like I've come to terms with it. And I think like a lot of the whole story of my life is coming to terms with it. And I think like in a way, like I know that talking about pregnancy and all of that is a really hard subject to talk about within the ME community. But I really feel like this book is more than that. It's more about coming to terms with the life you now have and being okay with that, you know, because I've spent a long time not ever being okay with it and not ever being satisfied by it. And in that time, I lost living. I didn't live. I literally was looking for the next goal, for the next thing. I had to, like, I wouldn't see people because then that might make me more poorly. So then I won't do it. I was never looking at it from a holistic point of view and actually treating like the whole of me and making sure that I had, because in seeing people socially, yes, it made me physically more unwell, but it fed me mentally, and it, conditioned to me to realize what I was aiming for or what I needed to get to. It all connects. But the problem was the hospitals that I was in, I would almost say the conditioning I had in that time was to never accept that, was to never live within that parameter. It was always about the next thing. And to come to terms with the fact that that's not how it has to be, and actually admitting that, and admitting that maybe the way I dealt with it is not necessarily the way I would deal with it now. But I feel like that's really empowering to know that and accept that and be able to say to people, I wouldn't just fight it. I wouldn't just do that. That for me feels like I've really learned a lot, and how to manage that.
So we're kind of talking about acceptance, aren't we? But it's like, it's such a difficult thing, isn't it? Because it's acceptance with still like a level of actually we want to live and we want a life, and it's just always trying to balance that, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
And yeah, if we don't do things, then we're kind of like, how do we make sense of life when
Yeah.
months and
Yeah.
years go by? But at
Yeah.
the same time, we have to kind of
Yeah. Everything in moderation, I think.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, like, my daughter has this game, and it's called a balance game, and it's like a wooden block which is rocks, and you have to put all these wooden blocks onto it and make sure it balances. And I always feel that's a really good way of describing how I have to do sort of my life now. So if I go out with my son, then I have to put a balance on there, but then I have to put a balance on the other side to say, right, then I'm going to rest for that, or I'm going to rest the day before so I can balance it. And then I'm going to pick up my daughter, then that's another thing. So everything costs. And that idea for me, like having that balance board and having to, like you have a cost for everything, and everything is about balancing, is actually a really good way for me to think about it, and me to become more aware, and I think like sometimes it's for me, it's also about, I really feel like how everyone else feels about it, like how everyone else copes with it, as well, because I think like it's a family that are going through this, right? It's not just me, it's everyone. And so how I react now, so like me doing this now, I know I need to rest afterwards and I need that time away, but that means I won't be there when my daughter comes home from school, but that's okay. But it's all a balancing, do you know what I mean? It affects everyone. And that's sort of, what I've really learnt about.
Yeah. Well, we probably both need to go and rest. Actually, I know
Yeah.
I do,
I was going to say,
it is. It's
I have
like,
to go now.
yeah,
A bit philosophical for you. I'm sorry. Like,
no, it's
it's kind of the place that I'm at the moment. It's
yeah,
just,
and like
yeah,
I'm aware that like when I'm making a podcast, like we need to be like whoever we have on the podcast, and for me and Dov, who we do it together as well, like we want to be like really authentic about our own sort of state of being as well. And like
yeah,
for me, I've like not done anything for the last 2 weeks, like literally apart from like
yeah,
surviving, and
yeah.
then like sort of kind of coming to do this today. So like, but
Yeah.
I really appreciate your time, and
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And it's just so wonderful to have always had your support, and to know that you can, like, I come away from the social media world a lot. I used to be on it all the time, but I
yeah,
can't really manage that now. But when I come on, it's so nice to see like the regular,
yeah,
the sort of the ones who have always been there.
yeah.
Yeah, and thank you.
And yeah, I would just encourage everybody to, I would say, but read the first two books first, because I think then the third one will make more sense. But like, if you
Yeah,
have read the first two,
yeah,
then
I mean, as I say, like, I really want it to be that celebration. And even if you don't read it as like an ME sufferer, because I mean, I can understand that it can be triggering, but in a way, that third book is there to be like the antidote to the other two, but also get other people to read them that you know, friends and family who don't necessarily understand it, because we still live in this world where no one understands the condition. And I think sometimes being able to give someone a book or something that actually explains a hell of a lot, not necessarily exactly the same suffering, but the
experience.
extremes, you know, and
Yeah.
that experience, then I just hope that that will, you know, people will learn from that. My aim is to get doctors to read it. That
Yeah.
is my aim. So you never know. You see how this sort of painting malarkey goes, and then we'll see where I get to.
No, it's brilliant. Well, thanks a lot, and yeah, we'll look forward to for reading the book when it comes out, and I'll put links and stuff like that. Is that something people can pre-order if they want? Or
Yeah, please do pre-order if you can. It makes a massive, massive difference to what people are able to do. At the moment, it's not available on audiobook, but I will be doing readings from it on my World of One Room Facebook page. And my aim is to try and get it to there. But unfortunately, in the publishing world, you've got to have sold lots of books and all it is. It's not as simple as that. But the first book is on audiobook, but the others are waiting for that.
brilliant. So yes, thanks for coming on, and yeah, all the
Thanks.
best. Thanks.
Thank you.